It's the show you know and love, Vinyl Ventures, and we've got a treat for you today. We have a guest. We haven't had a lot of guests this year, but we have a guest, and this is the show we've been promising probably since we started doing the show, a Beatles show.
Yeah, and what really brought it out was the documentary, the Peter Jackson documentary that came out about a year ago. And this is a show that we wanted to do with Keith. Keith has been a supporter of Vinyl Ventures. He directs a lot of the shows. He helped with the light design, the set design. He's all over the show. And it just so happens that he is probably the foremost knowledgeable person about any Beatles stuff that either of us know. So welcome to the show, Keith.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will say this, I'm not an expert.
Well,
I'm not a historian. I should say I'm not a historian. I haven't done official research. I don't have documented papers. I've not written anything that's been referenced. This is all just stuff that I've come up with from watching, listening, my own thoughts as to what it is about how these things, this group, it's influenced the world.
It's been about 23 years, 24 years since Keith and I have been good friends, and since then, the one thing that's brought us together is the Beatles. I mean, the name of our company together is from a Beatles song. So if there's ever anything in popular culture, anything that pops up, Keith's the one I go to. And since we've started doing the show, we've talked about doing this, and schedules or priorities or other things haven't worked out well. But we're really glad to have you.
Good to be here.
It was great talking to you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's it. All right.
Hope you enjoyed the show.
What's the next show we're going to do? Because I don't know anything about other bands.
Let's do something about Fleetwood Mac. I don't know. There's a lot of ways that you can tackle a subject like the Beatles. There are so many things you can dig into, and that was important for you to have a way to kind of get into this. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I just, the first thing that I think you got to talk about with the Beatles, everybody knows it. It's not unknown, but the impact that they've had on the world, both in music, pop culture, everyday life in certain places is impacted by this group of people. And it's not just the four of them you see on the record. It's George Martin. It's, whether you want to count him or not, Phil Spector's influence on some things through the process. You have Jeff Emmerich. And now you've got Giles Martin is now into it as well. So there's been all the curators of this stuff over the years. Yoko's had a part of curating some of it. Olivia Harrison's done a lot of it. Her involvement with the Love show in Vegas was huge with the Cirque du Soleil show. So there's a lot of people that have, just besides these four people, that have influenced. But this music, it's the only thing that I think of comes anywhere close to, we're still listening to Beethoven and Bach and Mozart hundreds of years later. It's the only thing that I know that really truly has had those kinds of legs to stay, and almost even in a bigger way because of the recorded medium of it and how it influenced us with video and film and everything else.
Well, and also because the approachability of it, because anybody, there are those outliers that you talk to who just say they hate the Beatles or they talk shit about the Beatles. But, you talk of classical composers and things like that, and even still today, that seems like a upper crust kind of thing that maybe isn't approachable by everybody. The Beatles are there for everybody. And I don't think there's not a border, there's not an obstacle to keep anybody from the music of the Beatles.
Yeah, and it's every generation seems to find them through one way or another. My parents didn't listen to them. I found them through a friend whose dad actually. It was not only was it my introduction to the Beatles, it was my introduction to CDs. I had a buddy that I went to his house and he's like, "Hey, you got to check out this thing my dad got." And he takes me into his house, and it's 1987, or it may have been 88. And he goes, "Hey, check this out." And he pulls out this thing. It's this little silver disc. I looked at the cover, and I think, wow, that's an interesting kind of thing. What is that? He's like, "This is a record. It's an album. It's a tape, And so he puts it in, and it was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. His dad had bought on CD. And it was the first real introduction to CDs I had. It was my first introduction to the Beatles. And so that just kind of opened up the world. But that opened up my generation. It wasn't my parents or anything else. I came across the CD and the music just hit me. Music that was 20 years old at the time, I listened to, and it didn't sound 20 years old to me. It sounded fresh and new.
Yeah.
And I do that now. You listen to music from the 1960s, even stuff that obscure stuff you don't know. You can still peg it as, this is from 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of this stuff doesn't have that sound. It's almost evergreen. I think in general, music has become that way more in the last 20 years than it was before. But it's still this stuff going back, and every generation finds them. Some generations after me found them in commercials. Once they started licensing the songs to be used in commercials and things like that, that introduced people to the music. And so it's an interesting process by which they've found it. And I remember seeing an interview with Paul McCartney talking about how he was against licensing their music in commercials. But once, I think Revolution was the first one that for Nike that was licensed to use.
Which was brilliant.
Which I also believe was because of Michael Jackson. He's the one that bought the library, and he's the one that started doing that against McCartney's wishes at that time. But McCartney later said, he realized what that did introduce their music to a whole nother generation, or to a whole nother group of people that may not have been introduced to their music in another way.
Across cultures, too, because you're using Nike as the springboard for it. I think Nike knows no boundaries either.
I'm sure by the year 2000, the money rolling into his pocket because of the additional sales of albums and everything else because of the exposure
might have
probably didn't hurt his change of opinion about it being used in those things. But so it's but again, that global impact, generational impact. I mean, just every generation. That's immeasurable to begin with, and that's the first thing you kind of got to look at. Is this is a collection of music that's just continued to grow.
It's finite, but somehow it evolves.
Somehow they always find new stuff to put out.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought 20 years ago that when the anthologies came out that, that's the last we're going to hear of new stuff from the band.
Yeah, we're not going to hear from this band anymore.
And now all of a sudden, every year there's something else coming out. So, but that kind of impact, I wanted to talk about that first, in terms of everybody understands it. Everybody knows, even if you're not a fan of them, you know who the Beatles are.
Right.
Everybody knows John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And
that's the thing. Across the globe, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who has never heard of the Beatles.
And there aren't many musical acts even in my lifetime, maybe one or two that I think even have a chance of being even partially as long-standing as them.
Well, and you think about it too. It's not just the music, but it's the faces. There aren't many bands that people know and recognize the faces of the members as easily and as quickly, even through the era of music videos in 1980s.
Yeah.
If I saw the members of Duran Duran on the street, I wouldn't recognize them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's another kind of
know their names.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just one more layer in this whole thing. They began that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were the first group that people knew John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Yeah. So there's a huge impact. In fact, Paul was quoted one time as saying something about that too, about how it was really weird to stop and think about the fact that the entire world knew who he was. In the 60s, the entire world knew who the Beatles were. They knew who they were. And
that has to be simultaneously the most loneliness-inducing and the opposite of loneliness at the same time.
And that's where they talk about the four of them through all the fighting and the breakups and the hard feelings that they had. It's one of the things that they talk about is the only people they had that understood what they were doing through was the other three of them, or it was the three others. So it was the four of them, and that was it. They were on their kind of own little island. They're the only ones that really knew what it felt like to be going through that at the time.
And it happened relatively quick for them from the time they became popular.
It did in some ways. I mean, they were becoming popular slowly. They put their work in like any other band does to get to that point. Right. They had a big following in Liverpool. and they had they gained a good following in England and even in Germany. But it was really when Love Me Do, when they signed with EMI, they released Love Me Do, and it just took off in England, and it took off in around Europe. That's when they started to feel that. So then you go through that, you go through Hard Day's Night, you get to the point that, in 1964, I Want to Hold Your Hand comes out in the United States, and it just set them to the next. I mean, it just, at that point in time, there was no turning back for them. It was, they were in it.
Yeah.
70 million viewers watched them on Ed Sullivan, the first appearance on Ed Sullivan. I mean, in a country at the time that probably only had, I don't know the numbers. Somebody will point it out, I'm sure. The country probably only had 225, 250 million people in it at the time.
Yeah.
And you got 70 million of them sitting and watching the TV to see these four guys play music.
It's unbelievable.
So that's kind of where I wanted to start. Was everybody knows it. That's a huge part of everything that we're doing. And I think what we're going to talk about in the next little bit is what partially leads to that. Why that is still the case. And on that note, I'm going to pull out some of my notes because I want to have them and get the numbers as close as I can to being right. I did bring quite a bit of notes to try to keep it at least somewhat accurate in my numbers.
Your research is Bill Hayes approved.
Bill would be proud.
So overall album sales, including studio albums, other LPs that were done with music that had been created, compilations, that kind of stuff, physical single sales, and digital single sales. The Beatles are number one by almost 100 million records. They've sold 420 million, and this is taken from I don't remember the source, but it's taken from a source I found online. It compiles, because it's hard to compile worldwide record sales numbers. There's so many different places and everything you got to pull them. So this is somebody's attempt at it. I found it to be pretty interesting way they had it laid out. But number one was Beatle, number two was Michael Jackson, but Michael Jackson's at 335 million. The Beatles are at 420 million in terms of total, and they have it the CSPC total, which there's a thing. But so studio album sales, the Beatles actually have not sold as much as Michael Jackson. They're only 160 million compared to 182 for Michael Jackson.
Studio albums?
Studio albums. It's the other LPs. It's the collections and things like that that they have a huge advantage.
So they don't consider the collections, even if it's studio material. They don't consider that a studio.
They don't. They put these into the other LP sales.
Oh, okay.
And the Beatles actually have 203 million of those compared to their 160 studio albums.
Unbelievable.
In terms of sales, and then they also have quite a few more singles.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say the singles, because they really...
Yeah, and what they did was for the total sales number, that 420, they basically did a ratio of 1.5 singles. It takes, a single counts as 1.5 of 10. So basically it takes about
7 or 8?
6 singles to equal
an album.
Okay. 6 to 6.5. So, but yeah, so those numbers are huge. I mean, 420 million on that, and it drops off. Then after Michael Jackson, you have Elvis, who's real close to him, to Michael Jackson. You got Queen, Madonna, the Stones, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and the thing is that it's just an incredible number of records. And that's where, but if you notice, all of these top people are from the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah. When albums were,
and it's a huge part of it. You have to go all the way down to 12th on the list, which I consider a more recent one, which is Eminem. He's 12th on the list of album sales.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. I never would have expected that. And that's worldwide, right?
This is worldwide, and this is one guy's attempt to put these numbers together as a way of taking all the different things and compiling them to create a list.
Man,
it's just an interesting. Sales don't necessarily mean better. It just shows it helps to show impact of that person's music on people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it also speaks to the power of marketing for these companies to be able to get this out. It sounds like at the beginning of the Beatles' career, since Capitol, the American arm of EMI, was kind of lukewarm on them, and so the starting point for them, there were different, different people disseminating their their stuff. And
but singles were the big thing.
Right.
Singles were the big thing early on.
And that's also funny that they're, as they evolved as a band, that became less and less.
It did, and that's an interesting. It's kind of where I was going to go with the next thing. Is that the Beatles are known for Sgt. Pepper and the idea of kind of really launching the concept album. Well, what they also were a part of was a movement in the early '60s that went from the idea of singles being what was driving sales, and then you made an album that had filler songs that were around the singles, maybe, to the album becoming the focal point of the sales. And that there were no longer filler tracks. They were all tracks that had importance. Yes, there were some that were released as singles. So they were part of a movement in that as well. They weren't the first to necessarily to do that. A lot of people... So go back to 1948, Columbia Records developed what we now call the LP. That's what they called it then as well. It was a long play. You could get up to 52 minutes on it. It rotated at 33 and a third. They developed it. They went to RCA to try to develop it with them. RCA was kind of balked at it. They were going to do their own thing. A couple years later, RCA ended up coming back around and going, okay, we're on board. And they gave them the right to use the technology to sell the records. And
was RCA trying to develop a different speed?
I think if I remember correctly, and I don't have the stuff, I think it was a different format of disc that they were wanting to. Because I think part of it was they didn't believe that the long play would be successful.
Yeah.
And before it was 78, right?
I think it was 78 before that. Yeah. And they first had success with it with show tunes, classical pieces, things that needed a longer format. Right. And that had natural collections of stuff together. And so they started in the late 40s with that. I have a list of albums that were the top-selling album of the year starting in 1955. You start off in 1955. It was Oklahoma. And 56, My Fair Lady. The big one early on, and the other big one early on, Christmas albums.
Oh,
in 1957, you had Elvis's Christmas album. In 1958, you had an Elvis collection. It wasn't an album that was put together. It was a collection of songs that Elvis had done. That was the number one. 59 was Harry Simone choral "Sing We Now of Christmas." So it was a Christmas album.
Okay.
The next year was Nat King Cole's "Magic of Christmas." Leonard Bernstein's "West Side Story" in 1961. 1962 was The First Family, which I don't know that. Von Meter. The First Family?
Actually had that.
I don't know what it was.
I picked it up at Goodwill. It's a show.
Okay, it's another
but
show.
It looks like they're in front of the album cover. It's very Kennedy-esque.
Interesting.
This family in front of the White House.
Huh.
Yeah. So that's what was selling on LP.
Yeah.
Through the 50s was show tunes, compilations. Frank Sinatra had an early record that kind of had a theme. Ray Charles had a record early on that had a theme to it, but they were all cover songs.
Right.
And so through the late 50s, they were doing those kinds of things. What really then led to the birth of the album in some ways, a lot of people point to the day the music died. When Buddy Holly,
the Big Bopper,
Richie Valens, and Big Bopper climbed into a plane. February 3rd, 1959.
Yeah.
It was considered kind of a big thing because the influence now became much heavier of this. People started trying to copy their sounds, and they were really a big influence on the next steps. So through the late 50s, you had the Frank Sinatras, the Ray Charles doing these kinds of things occasionally. But then in the early 60s, you had the Beach Boys. Their Help Me Rhonda, and there was another one of their albums that they had completely written on their own and put out. It was looked at more of a collection. The big one was Bob Dylan, which I told you earlier. What's the name of the one again?
Highway 61 Revisited. Or no, sorry, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan.
Freewheelin' Bob Dylan.
Which is his second record.
Is kind of considered, because it's all original, it's all goes together as a collective. It goes away from, before the 1960s, there was and even before Bob Dylan and the Beatles started doing this, there was a very formulaic way of putting out a record of pop music or of any kind of music like that, and that was you started off with the second single that was released from the album, then you go to a ballad, and then you have some filler stuff, and then you start off the second side of the LP with the first single that was released, and there was kind of this formulaic way of doing it. Bob Dylan really kind of started to change the idea that there was this album as a concept, not as a concept album, but the album itself was important as a piece of art, as an artwork.
Isn't that crazy?
And then you get into 1963, and what they realized was, while they weren't necessarily thinking of it with Beatles records, 1963 with the Beatles, 1964 Beatles for Sale. 65 was dominated by The Sound of Music. And in some charts I've seen, The Sound of Music actually had the best-selling LP in 65, 67, 68, and 69.
Jeez.
Now, this list I have here shows 66 was Revolver, 67 was Sgt. Pepper's, 68 was Inagata-Davida.
Wow.
According to the list. And then 69 was the Beatles. Then you go into Simon & Garfunkel, Zeppelin. So the Beatles, though, in 1963, took that reign of the LP from show tunes and collections to albums. People started buying the albums.
Yeah, because they were buying singles.
They were buying singles. For pop music, everything was singles before that.
Yeah, like Elvis. Elvis wasn't selling albums. He was selling singles.
Yeah. Although his best-selling album was his Christmas album. It was they would do a Christmas album, but again, they weren't original songs. So those were all covers of traditional songs.
Doing traditional Christmas songs.
So that development into the album was important, and they were, like I said, they were a part of that. They weren't necessarily leading that completely on their own. They had influences here. They, obviously, Bob Dylan was a huge influence on them when they came here in 1964. Both musically, meeting him, they were big fans of his. Meeting him.
Musically, politically,
right,
sociologically,
he was a huge impact on them. And so,
didn't he introduce them to pot?
Yes,
yeah,
and that was apparently the first. That was apparently the first meeting. The story is around the first meeting, first time he met them in a hotel in New York when they came to do the Ed Sullivan Show. He introduced, and apparently the way the story I've heard it told is that Ringo was the first one that he introduced to it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
So, but yeah, so again, you get this transformation. The Beatles come out in the UK with their singles of Love Me Do, which just took off. And that their first British album was Please Please Me, which is the famous picture of them around the up 2 or 3 floors up on the balcony of, I forget what the building is. It may have been the record label building or something. I don't remember for sure, but
I can't remember what building it was, but it's the blue and red collections.
Yeah,
and it's also the cover for Please Please Me. And if you pull out the sheets I gave you, it's actually, and
there they are on the.
Yeah, you've got this album cover here. That is the cover. I don't have the Please Please Me album, but that is the cover picture that is used on the Please Please Me album.
These collections, man, when I was a kid.
The blue and the red collections they're some of the best collections.
Yeah. I listened to them more on 8-track than records at the time, so I didn't scratch the hell out of these.
Yeah. But so that picture is from the Please Please Me album. The album started selling in England. Like, I guess American record labels didn't want to touch them. Capitol, who was EMI's partner in America, didn't want to touch them. So VJ was, I think you were telling me, VJ was convinced to release some Beatles records singles, as well as this Introduce the Beatles record that's behind here, as a package deal with another artist that they were going to release music of.
The Beatles were a throw-in. Mm-hmm. A throw-in band because they wanted, let me find his name, Fred Ifield.
So Fred is the guy they wanted, but they're like,
because he was blowing up in Europe,
yeah,
in England, and they said, "Well, hey, can you take this band also?"
Interesting.
So the Beatles were the add-on.
Huh. And the VJ Records released the first 2 or 3 singles. They released this first album, which if you look at it, the track list is similar to Please Please Me, but it's not exactly the same. It does not have Love Me Do on it, which appeared on the British version of Please Please Me. This album that I'm looking at here is actually a knockoff recreation that's probably from the early 70s. Somebody had made it to try to knock it off. There's several different versions of it out there. It's hard to find the originals, but if you go look online, there's a way to decipher through labels the order of songs, whether or not it's the original album. And then this one is
a Canadian release.
Canadian release.
That
I think the first Canadian release that was on Capitol. But so you had this dichotomy that they were releasing singles, and the Beatles would record songs as singles that would sometimes end up on their albums, but not always. Early on, the singles didn't end up on the albums, but the American versions of the albums weren't even the same because they didn't get picked up here when they first started. So then in 1964, when they did the Ed Sullivan Show and they blew up here, Capitol's like, oh wait, we've got something we got to do.
We better get on this.
We better get on this, and so they started putting out albums that were Beatles albums
at a feverish pace.
Some of them had the same artwork that appeared, and like the Meet the Beatles, which was the first one that Capitol did, I believe, had the picture from With the Beatles, which is the Beatles' second album but it's called Meet the Beatles.
Right.
And so then they started but it has songs from both the single of I Want to Hold Your Hand on it, which never appeared on a British album.
Right.
And it also included I Saw Her Standing There, which was on Please Please Me.
Yeah.
The British version. So you have all these various albums, right? And
permutations of them.
Right. And through 1964, I'll just read you the list real fast. Because in England they had released, in late 62 they released Please Please Me. In 1963, I believe it was, the next one was With the Beatles and Hard Day's Night. So these had all come out before they made it really big here. So then they start releasing the American albums. They start releasing songs here. They blow up. 1964. January 20th, 1964, Meet the Beatles came out. That kind of coincided with the hit of I Want to Hold Your Hand leading up to the Ed Sullivan
appearance.
show.
Yeah.
April 10th, the Beatles' second album came out.
That's fast.
In June, A Hard Day's Night came out. They released it. In July, they released Something New that had 12 or 13 tracks on it. And the misnamed Beatles 65 came out in December of 1964. So we're now at what? How many albums is that in 64? That's
like
five albums they've put out in 64. And these are all they're pulling songs from singles from the British versions of albums and just throwing them all together. Then you had in March of 65, the early Beatles came out, which was a going back and grabbing. It basically was the Please Please Me album with some stuff missing. Then you had Beatles 6, which came out in June of 1965. So we're now 18 months into this, and they've released 7 albums under the Beatles name.
That's what happens when you're that far behind the ball.
Yeah. August 13th, 1965, Help came out. And now they start to coordinate timing-wise with the British releases because they had caught up.
Yeah.
Rubber Soul came out, and it was the albums were starting to come together as one collective thing. Because really, Rubber Soul, in my opinion, is when the Beatles finally hit the idea of here's a collection of songs as an album that we want you to listen to together. There's not filler. There's not singles that have other stuff around it. This is an album that should be listened to as an album. That's when they finally got there, in my opinion.
Is there one cover on that one?
No. The last cover, the last cover song they did appeared
Till
on
There Was You?
No, that was actually on that was on Please Please Me.
Oh, okay.
And it was the last cover they did came off of the Beatles for Sale.
Oh, okay.
So they did Please Please Me with the Beatles. Both were a mix of covers and originals, which are the British albums.
Right.
A Hard Day's Night was all original. And then Beatles for Sale had some covers on it. And after that, the record label finally gave in to the idea that they didn't have to have them doing cover songs. Their own material was good enough to carry the album. So everything
a revelation.
Everything after Beatles for Sale was original music by them. But so Rubber Soul was that. And then they did release, even after Rubber Soul, to go back and pick up even more of the stuff that had been missed on some of the earlier stuff. They released a record called Yesterday and Today.
which is a
The legendary
Yep.
Babies.
Butcher cover.
Yep. And then Revolver was kind of the same, but it missed 3 songs in the American version had 3 songs that were not on it that were on the British version. But again, so now by the time you get to Sgt. Pepper was identical.
Yeah.
By the time you got to Sgt. Pepper, it was the same album, and that's when you get into the true concept album as well.
Right.
They
Right.
really took it to the next step, and that's where the Beatles progressed almost ahead of everybody. Now, Paul McCartney has been quoted as saying that he gives the first credit to a concept album to Frank Zappa.
Freak Out?
Yes, it was Freak Out.
Freak Out.
Yeah.
See, it's
Very
in
good.
there.
Yeah.
And Paul McCartney actually kind of credits that in 1966.
Yeah. That's Zappa and the Mothers.
Yeah, and so you're
Yeah,
in
that's
this
what I was
time,
saying. It had to be the Mothers.
Yeah. Yeah.
but so you're in this time period of things are changing for them. They had been so big, it took the American record label time to catch up. The only other album that was different going forward after Revolver was Magical Mystery Tour. And that's because in England, Magical Mystery Tour was released as a 7-inch EP that just had the songs from the movie in it.
None of the score.
None of the score. The American version of Magical Mystery Tour actually included singles and other songs surrounding the Sgt. Pepper's album that weren't released on the Sgt. Pepper American version that filled out, because Capitol didn't feel as though EPs were selling in the American market. So they didn't want to release the Magical Mystery Tour as an EP like it was in Britain. So they filled out a second side of the album.
They may not have felt like they were selling, but they were probably also thinking we can get more money from an entire album.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, is that
Yeah.
they just thought that it was going to sell more being released as a
Full
full album instead
These
of being
guys have enough
released as a
stuff that we
thing.
can fill it up.
Yeah.
And that's where what they did was they had the Magical Mystery Tour songs, and then they added Hello, Goodbye. They added Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, All You Need Is Love, and Baby You're a Rich Man, which all came from singles that were done
Right.
in that era of the Sgt. Pepper era that they made. So that's the only other album that was different. But again, so you got this concept going forward that the album is starting to sell.
Yeah.
It is a collection of songs, and that's where I think the Beatles changed the music world as much as any. Is that they created that they were a big push of that concept of the
album.
of the album,
Not just the concept album, the concept of an album,
and Beatles,
which is a huge distinction.
right, the Beatles were influenced by others in the
Yeah.
process of doing it, and that's the other thing I think the Beatles are so good at. You look at their early records; there's so much influence by other musicians. They wrote in the style of people. They tried to copy what they saw, what they liked.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't just creating; they were taking and interpreting as well.
Right.
Well, yeah.
And that's why I say they weren't solely responsible for the idea that the album became so big, but as apparent by sales, they were a major force in it. They were the ones that benefited from that push, and they helped push it into that direction.
And I don't think, and I love the fact that you kind of plucked this out of all of the stuff that we could be talking about, because I don't think many people talk about that aspect
No.
of the Beatles. There are all of the other ways that people talk about how the Beatles have influenced the music industry, sociologically, politically, all of it. But that's not something that a lot of people talk about. So I'm not sure it's something that a lot of people realize.
Right.
Well,
before Sgt. Pepper.
Right.
People understand that Sgt. Pepper was a full-on concept album.
Right.
Yeah.
We're going to do something that's going to have a full theme that goes through the whole thing. It's not going to change. It's all really meant to be. Before that, the idea of the album, that they're pushed towards that, I think is underappreciated. Like you said,
Well, and guests we've had on the show that are a little that they came of age during that time, they talk about it was a big deal to get, hey, we're not just going to get the single. I can get a full record with all this stuff on it, all these songs. So, I mean, part of it is they had the catalog of, they had enough songs that, hey, I want to buy them all.
Yeah.
I don't want just 2.
and the idea that the American albums were different, and the American albums, obviously, the American audience was huge.
Yeah.
compared to the rest of the world. I mean, that's why they all wanted to come here, because the number of albums you could sell here was so much larger than it was anywhere else in the world.
Right.
But what's interesting is that our parents' generation, they grew up with a different idea of Beatles albums than I did.
Yeah.
Because I knew the CDs that came out in 87 and 88.
Right. And by the way, before, not to interrupt you, but your friend that introduced you to the CD, did he have that first collection that came in the wood box with the top?
No,
so he just had the individual CDs.
He just had the individual CDs.
Okay.
And they were actually released in 2 batches, I believe. They released the first 4, which would have been Please Please Me, With the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, and Beatles for Sale as a group. And they were all released in mono. And it was George Martin kind of pushed back on them trying to do a stereo mix of those because of the technology and things, and that's so that they were gonna give him an opportunity to do a stereo mix of the second 2 of Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale, and they ended up, I think, deciding not to do it because of timing. Just didn't have time. They wanted to get them out. You know, they were coming out late relatively for CDs for an old record collection. Some of it's that they were caught up in litigation between the band and EMI and rights and who gets money from what, and there was stuff that delayed some of that, and so at least that's the story that kind of goes along with a lot of it. But so when they released them on CDs, they released the British versions.
Yeah.
So I know all my Beatles albums I know were the British versions. So, you know, I have an original copy of Help. This is an original American version of Help. And you see the song listing on the front. Those are the songs that were in the movie. The rest of it, and exclusive instrumental music for the picture's soundtrack. So the rest of the album was made up of instrumental scores and things.
Right.
This is the re-release of the British version. And it has a big giant sticker that's square.
Yeah, it's square, so it's approved.
But if you look at its track listing, it filled out the second half of the record with other songs that were original songs that they had written.
Yeah, Act Naturally, It's Only Love.
Right. You Like Me Too Much.
You Like Me Too Much.
Tell Me What You See. I've Just Seen a Face. Yesterday, which did not appear in the movie Help, but it appeared on the British version of Help.
And Dizzy Miss Lizzy.
And Dizzy Miss Lizzy. And you could really, I personally think you look at this and you start to see their craft of an album.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was written around a movie concept, and they could do that. They told them, hey, we need to write a song that says this for the movie. And John and Paul would sit down and bang out a song for what the movie was, what they told them they needed to do.
It together.
They were writing songs on command for the record label, for the movie producers. Yeah. But you really start to see the craft of the album in the British version of Help. And it carried through to some extent in the American version, and you had at least the original ones from the movie that were all together as a collection.
Yeah.
And then they included the instrumentals.
Yeah.
But the other thing that it just came to me, and I hadn't had this thought before, as the idea of the album was introduced and their career kept going, that had to only be good for the record labels, because people began to be completists about certain artists. And so even though you have the British version, you now want the English version, or not the American version, the British version. Maybe it's the Beatles that are the reason that people are so nutty about collecting all of the different permutations of a record.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard to do with Beatles stuff because there's the post-wise, like you said, you've told me before that you were kind of introduced to the Beatles through the Red and Blue. Mm-hmm. I don't think of those as albums. Those to me are collections of songs that were put together because that's not where I discovered them from. I discovered them from the British albums, and I listened to all the British albums before I ever picked up the Red or Blue. So when I listen to the Red or Blue, it kind of feels weird to me because there's songs are out of place.
It's disjointed.
It doesn't have the flow that the records that the original albums did. I did fail to pull this one out that I have, which is the Beatles 65. I have no idea if this is an original printing, if it's a reprint. I have a feeling it's a reprint at some point in time or a knockoff.
It's in good shape, though.
But it's in good shape.
Yeah,
it's
in super shape.
But that's again, a misnomer. It was released in '64.
Just like 1984 by Van Halen, released in December 1983.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you're going for the idea that it's going to be the album for the next year. Yeah. I mean, we release a car model for the next year. It's crept forward. I think they're almost released in the middle of summer now for the next year.
It
car
used
model.
to be like August, September.
Right. Yeah. So I guess in that sense, it kind of makes sense. But I just thought I'd throw that one up there since it's one that I have, and it's one of my old ones. As to the albums, but then you get to the one that right now has been re-released as a new box set. And it's one that so many people consider. I go back. I can kind of consider Rubber Soul.
I do too.
The first real hard push towards that album. Rubber Soul inspired Pet Sounds. A lot of people think it was Revolver because of the fact that there was the back and forth between the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and Pet Sounds is what influenced Sgt. Pepper's. Mm-hmm. So they think, well, Revolver must have influenced Pet Sounds. Well, reality, they were coming out so fast. Rubber Soul was the one that influenced Pet Sounds. He hadn't heard Revolver when they started working on Pet Sounds yet because it hadn't come out. They hadn't heard Pet Sounds when they released Revolver because it hadn't come out.
Are you going to talk about what he said when he heard Revolver?
Well, it wasn't Revolver. It was when Brian Wilson heard Sgt. Pepper.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Brian Wilson was working on the next album to follow up Pet Sounds, and it was going to be called Smile. It's leaked out over the years. All the tracks are pretty much out there now. And
He's actually released it.
You could go compile it as an album, and listen to it, and think of it as an album. But the reason it didn't come out as an album was because when Brian Wilson listened to Sgt. Pepper, he goes, they just accomplished what I was trying to do. And he abandoned it. He saw Sgt. Pepper as he wasn't going to best it, so he kind of abandoned his next concept of what he was going to.
Now, he was probably on a tremendous amount of drugs.
Yeah. But so the bouncing back and forth between the Beach Boys and the Beatles on that. And Revolver is kind of misnomered as being part of that, and it really wasn't. I mean, it was it was not influenced by, it did not influence Pet Sounds.
Right.
Yeah.
The Beatles' music did in general. But this album is a pretty incredible album, beginning to end. They started this. The reason why a lot of people consider this one over Rubber Soul, in terms of it's changing the influence and everything else, is because this is about the time that they had come back from India.
Yeah,
they had started bringing in the sounds of the sitar. I think the sitar appears in this one, right? Tomorrow Never Knows.
Tomorrow Never Knows. Yeah.
Yep. They started to get away from the opening track with Taxman. Was a huge change in what the song topics were about. They started to get a little bit more political and things. They started to bring their life experiences and things into more of a direct way.
Not only that, it's a George Harrison song.
Yeah. Which is a
huge deal for a Beatles album to open with a Harrison song.
Yeah.
And they also, the other thing which I had never heard until this box set came out, and I was reading something the other day, and then I was listening to somebody talk about it. The solo played in Taxman is played by Paul McCartney.
On guitar?
On guitar.
Oh, wow.
The guitar solo is Paul McCartney. And I had never put it together, but Tomorrow Never Knows has a backwards guitar solo in it. And if you flip it back around, it sounds like it could be an alternate take of the Taxman guitar solo. So there's some theory that they were recorded, that all they did to get the guitar solo backwards in Tomorrow Never Knows was take one of the alternate takes from the Taxman session
and reverse
it.
Huh.
But this is
how cool is that?
A lot of that experimentation started with Revolver, and that's why a lot of people considered. The other place this one started to deviate was in the artwork. It really had more of an artistic feel to it.
Yeah.
Instead of a standard photo of the band someplace, they had
a mixed media with artistic, hand-drawn stuff and actual photos.
Yeah, and
but it is very different than.
Yeah, it's not a photo of the band.
Yeah.
You look at all the other photos, all the other albums up until that point in time, and it's all photos of the band.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, there are photos incorporated in here, but there's much more artistic. Rubber Soul had a little bit of it with the distorted lens and. Yep.
Yep. And the other thing, I mean, when you look at this and think of what's to come, it's also cutting actual photos out and placing them in here the way that they did for the group of Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah.
Which has been lampooned and taken after a million times since then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ringo Starr did it on the Ringo cover. He's in front of a group of, they have a whole audience that looks like they're in a theater.
Oh,
of a
no
whole bunch
kidding.
of people. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's that kind of influence, but yeah, so these influences really started to take us towards this album. It's really started to take the idea that you got to buy it as a collection.
Yeah.
And you start to get that. The Beatles didn't. The Beatles still recorded singles that were separate from the albums pretty much the whole time that they were together.
Which is kind of crazy.
They never got to the point that they incorporated singles coming off the albums like we get now. You buy an album in the 70s, the singles were going to be on the album.
Right.
You could still buy the single if you didn't want to buy the whole album, but
Right.
the singles were usually issued as part of the album. But they never did that as much, which in the end led to a couple of interesting LPs.
Right.
Because they realized that a whole bunch of stuff wasn't out there. And that goes to, they kind of took this concept album. So they go from this to Sgt. Pepper's, where then it coincided with, this is the end of their touring as well. The sound was becoming too complicated. They were tired of touring. They didn't want to be doing it.
And the technology, and the one thing that a lot of people don't remember is, and we talked about this before, is the technology for like arena or playing baseball stadiums was not there.
Yeah, they couldn't overpower the sound of the crowd.
Right.
And so they couldn't even hear themselves playing.
Right.
And
which is just incredible.
Yeah. So, it wasn't but a few years later, the technology was starting to catch up. Unfortunately, they never got back out to that.
Right.
But then when did the Who come in and start blowing stadiums away with sound levels?
Well, I mean,
it was
early 70s.
Yeah.
So same thing with Zeppelin.
Yeah. Once they realized they needed to have that technology and they started developing it, it took off. But they never had that when they were performing live.
Yeah.
So they became much more studio based. So they went in the studio and recorded Sgt. Pepper, which really is probably still to this day definitely credited as the start of the concept album.
Oh, yeah.
There were a lot of others that came very quickly after it, but it was the start of the concept, which, going back to the Beach Boys thing real fast, and you guys talked about it with me before, about the idea that Pet Sounds, the reason it's titled what it is it was
they were his
pet sounds, and it was so that's for another show at another time. But that's it's an interesting thing that, again, it was feeding off of that, but it really fed the concept, the idea of, hey, here's this whole collection of songs that you have to listen to as a collection of songs. It's the one that unified their albums release worldwide for the most part.
Yep.
There's still some outliers in the Japanese and the other places where things were done that aren't 100%.
But they really, they took it to the next level in a lot of ways with the cover, with their characters and the costumes that their characters are wearing. And then this little section of the record created a whole story that people still argue about today.
Paul's dead.
Yeah. And it's just... It's really amazing if you step back a few steps and kind of start putting all of these things together, just how powerful this band was.
Yeah.
I believe I heard a story. I don't know if it's true or not, but that Hitler is in this picture.
Oh, really?
But that he was hidden behind the band.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because they were taking all these people that influenced, them and other people and all this influence, everything. And Hitler's picture was in there, but it's behind the band and you can't see it. And they thought,
I don't know. Was in there before they stepped in for the photo.
But it was hidden behind them. I don't know if it's true. I've heard this story. I don't even remember where I heard this story from. If I did, I would credit it to whoever I heard the story from. But
there's an easy, well, maybe not easy, but I have seen photos of this photo shoot without the band in place.
Yeah. Oh, really?
So it would be interesting.
It may be one of those things like the Paul Dead thing that is a completely made up thing.
Right.
That somebody said, hey, this would be funny to say if we did this.
Right.
But I have heard that story, so I don't know if it's true, but could be. Who knows? There's so much stuff that went on. I think it's interesting watching all the different things about them and reading about them, the dynamic that they had amongst themselves, and the understanding that the Beatles were something even bigger than them. And that's where this started to come from, was the idea that the Beatles were so big that they no longer really were in control of the Beatles.
Right.
And so let's become another band.
Yeah. Let's do
something else so we can become somebody else. And that's kind of the way I read it.
Or take some of the tedium out of it.
And it's because
it really did work, because when I talk about the Beatles, I should probably be talking about Revolver to the end, but I always talk about Sgt. Pepper to the end.
Yeah.
That being a delineating album.
It was because of the other thing that changed too, and it's just don't want to get to it before I was going to get to it. I'll go ahead and talk about it now. They've re-released Sgt. Pepper. They've redone Abbey Road. They've redone the White Album. They've redone Let It Be. And there's a lot of question as to, well, why did they start with Sgt. Pepper? Sgt. Pepper was the first time that they didn't record individual tracks for different instruments and vocals. And Revolver was recorded on a 4-track machine. The master tapes are guitar, drums, and the backing vocal is over here. And this one's got the lead vocal, the tambourine, and this on it. And if you listen to Rubber Soul and Revolver in the stereo versions, they're separated big time. They really did the tracks that were together, but they've been unable to remix them because all this stuff was layered on top of each other. They don't have the individual tracks. Well, after Get Back came out and Peter Jackson spent all the time to develop, one of the things that made the Get Back documentary so much more in depth than what Michael and Lindsay Hogg was able to do with the original Let It Be film was the Beatles, the four of them had agreed to do the film. They wanted to be a part of the film, but they didn't always like everything that they said being recorded. So they would sit in the studio, and when they were talking about things, they would sit and strum on their guitars and pound on the piano
while they were talking,
that the instruments would drown out what they were saying.
Right.
So Michael Lindsay Hogg had all of this stuff that was deemed unusable. Well, Peter Jackson worked with people, I don't know who it was, to develop the technology. And we've been going this way for a while. They were able to go in and isolate every sound on the recording. So they were able to get all of these conversations back crystal clear.
Lost.
They could tell all these stories that were completely lost.
Yeah.
Well, that technology, Giles Martin has said, Peter Jackson's technology of doing that is what's allowed him now to go back and redo Revolver. And the quote I saw was something paraphrased was, imagine you have a chef that has baked a cake, and you now have the technology to go back and separate out every ingredient into individual ingredients without there being any batter left stuck to it. So now you have all the original ingredients and you can remake that cake the way you want to. And so you have all the original elements to do it. And that technology that was developed through that process and that was used for Get Back has now gone back and allowed them to remix Revolver.
It's just amazing.
And so we'll probably over the next several years see them going back and redoing all of the earlier stuff as well.
Right.
But EMI refused to upgrade the studio for the Beatles. I mean, when they were recording, what we now know as Abbey Road Studios was always known as EMI Studios for the band. They didn't know it as Abbey Road Studios until after the album came out, and that they renamed the studio that way. But they wouldn't let the Beatles, during this time frame of Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, they wanted to bring in different lighting and different furniture. EMI wouldn't allow them to do it. They're like, nope, we don't use that stuff. If you watch the Get Back film, George Harrison had to bring his 8-track recorder in for them to use because EMI didn't have an 8-track recorder.
They had a 4-track. George has an 8-track at home.
Yeah, I've got it at home. I'll bring in.
So there's a shot of the dudes unloading it from the box truck and bringing it into Abbey Road Studios, rolling it in for Let It Be.
But that's also why at the end when they ended up abandoning the Twickenham.
Yeah.
Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
The studios where they were recording it, and they went back to the studio. They actually went to Apple's recording studio, the one that they had built. It wasn't quite done when they moved into it then.
Where was that?
It was the one. It's where they did the concert on the roof.
Oh,
it was
on the roof.
that was the actual Apple studio, and it was, I think, one of the only times they recorded in that studio as a band was for that session, the Let It Be stuff, because they recorded Abbey Road at Abbey Road, which is how the album got its name.
Yeah.
They had gone back. They had gone back with several different names. They wanted to. They had considered the name Everest for the name of the album, and they were sitting around and they're like, "Well, we don't want to drag ourselves all the way up to Mount Everest to take a picture for the album cover." And so I think they, like everything else, I think it was
just offhanded.
It was Ringo's commented, "Well, why don't you just name it Abbey Road?" And they're like, "Okay." So they went out and took pictures on the street and they named the album Abbey Road. It changed. I mean, that alone changed the lexicon of music.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And in so many ways. But it was a convenience of, we don't want to have to deal with trying to do a cover photo someplace else. We're right here. We're all here together now. We got a photographer. Let's go do it.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. I mean,
and talking about album art and things, they still were fighting with the record label, but if you look at the Abbey Road cover, is there anything that jumps out to you that's different than other Beatles albums and really other albums at all of the time period?
Yeah, no text or anything.
That's right.
Yeah, there's no text.
There's no text. The record label didn't want them to release it that way. They thought, how will they know what it is if we don't put your name on it?
They're only the most 4 recognizable persons.
They're only
in
the biggest band in the world.
The record label thought, how will they know what it is if we don't put the text on it? And they ended up winning that battle, whoever it was that was fighting it. And there's not a word on the album.
Yeah.
This one's not a good example because it actually has the pictures on front. But even the White Album had the Beatles written on it. And the reason they could get away with that was because it's actually not called the White Album, it's the Beatles.
Right.
So it's a self-titled album.
I've never even thought about it because we've talked a lot in our shows because honestly, the Beatles have popped up in Vinyl Ventures, but not a lot. And that's another reason why we wanted to have you on the show for this. But one of the bands that we always talk about from an artwork perspective being art for art's sake is Pink Floyd. Mm-hmm. And, Dark Side of the Moon, same way. It just has the artwork on it. Now, obviously, this is different with their faces, or at least their profiles.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's recognizable. But, I've never really thought about this album not having any text on it. But,
it's true.
And it's and like I said, it changed the name of the studios.
Yeah.
Because they became known as the Abbey Road Studios. But yeah, so again, it's so deep in terms of the album, what they did. Continuing the concept after Sgt. Pepper, you had Magical Mystery Tour, which actually Brian Epstein died between Sgt. Pepper's recording sessions and Magical Mystery Tour, and that's when McCartney really took the reins of the band, and because Brian Epstein was the one that would always come in and go, "Okay, guys, it's time to record. Okay, guys, it's time to tour. Okay, now you got to do this." He was their manager. He kind of drove them. Well, starting with Magical Mystery Tour, that kind of became Paul's thing. Was that it was his idea to go and do this. They all loved it. I mean, looking back on it, I think Lennon's been quoted as saying it was one of his favorite Beatles albums, and that "I Am the Walrus" is one of his favorite songs. Because he said it was so there was so much depth to what was there and stuff. He so he was a big fan of it. Ringo loved the idea of what Paul had done and was taking them and taking charge and done that. Now it's funny that the next album was probably, outside of the Let It Be sessions, probably their most dysfunctional album as a band, where Ringo actually walked out at one point in time during the recording of it, and half the songs on the White Album are solo songs. There was only one of them or two of them in the studio recording it.
Yeah.
They weren't together as a band during that time frame.
It's so funny to me that that's the case too, because in our many discussions, the White Album, as I get older, I just love it more and more.
I've always loved it. It's always been my favorite.
It seems like something that you would love, but something that when I was a teenager, it was hard to kind of listen to and grasp onto. As I get older, and as I have more of an understanding about everything, and you kind of have all of the pieces together, I think that lends itself to listening to it too.
Yeah.
Well, the thing I think is interesting about it is interesting of the Beatles in general. So you had the concept album of Sgt. Pepper's. It all flows really well. But even in the flow, there's a pretty big dichotomy in the styles of songs.
Oh, totally.
Oh,
You know, Sgt. Pepper's is not the same song or not the same style of song as Fixing a Hole
Or a Day in a Life. Yeah.
So there's not the same sound, and the White Album really, really did. So this is the special edition that was put out. So it's obviously got the pictures on the front. It's not got the empty cover. This is, but you just start looking through the song list, and you've got things like you got things like Back in the USSR,
which is basically like a late 50s Beach Boys song.
But it's a little heavier.
Yeah.
You got Helter Skelter, which a lot of people point to as a early heavy metal song.
Yeah.
John Lennon goes even earlier than that and talked about how Ticket to Ride, the end of Ticket to Ride, their kind of freelance fade out is really a early indication of heavy metal.
I never heard that either.
He kind of goes back to that one, and if you listen to it, you can hear it.
Yeah.
It was definitely a heavier outro to a song than what you'd ever heard them do before.
That's true.
But then you've got things like Martha, My Dear, and Dear Prudence, and these slower,
Revolution Number 9.
Right. I mean, you got you got the experimental stuff. You've got you got all these experiments that they were doing. This wide range of like the hard rocking to the song "Good Night" is a lullaby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every record had these wide swings, but they somehow all go together. I find it hard to listen to some of these songs individually.
Yeah.
But when I listen to it as a collection, it's like, wow, now it just jumps out at me. And it's like I said, this was so disjointed in how they made it. This was probably, other than the Let It Be sessions, in terms of recording, they're most disjointed by far.
Is it possible that the fame and the familiarity that everybody had with these four dudes almost gave them license to do almost anything that they wanted to do? I mean, obviously they could do anything they wanted to, but nothing that they ever did was a bust, really.
Yeah, I don't know. I've wondered about that, because if you look at their solo work, McCartney's really the only one that took big, wide swings at things.
Right.
And if you look at the Beatles stuff, he was the one taking the biggest swings at different styles and things. Yeah. Even within
aside from George implementing all the Indian stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, they were able to work together as a band and make it all flow and go together, and they all enjoyed each other's influence to a certain extent at times. Obviously, there's a lot made about McCartney's unwillingness to allow George to have input both on his songs and in writing, both on recording McCartney's songs. He got very dictatorial of how he wanted the parts played.
Yeah, like didn't you say that like he'd be like, George, play the solo on this, and then George would mess around with it, and then Paul would be like,
I'll play it this
George,
way.
play it this way.
Right. Yeah, and so that's what caused George to walk out. And you see it in the Get Back documentary. He says, I'll play it any way you want me to.
Yeah.
Just tell me what you want me to do, and I'll play it. And I just couldn't take it anymore. It's like I said, I'm out of here. And
that was the British version of a tantrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you wonder. It makes you wonder if Brian Epstein were still around, would that have changed?
But like you started off asking about it, was the band so big that there's no way? Because again, the band became something other than the four of them.
Yeah.
The band became an entity.
Right. And they did it to themselves. Because honestly, what broke them up as much as the musical differences was the business differences. Was the difference in business. I mean, there's recordings that have come out about John suggesting that the follow-up album to Abbey Road be one where he writes 4 songs, Paul writes 4 songs, and George writes 4 songs.
And Ringo just plays
and then they would write 2 songs for Ringo to sing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they were still thinking about it at that point in time. But the real thing that broke them up at the end was, we're getting away from the idea of the album here a little bit, but one of the things that really started to break them up, and you see it happen in the Get Back documentary. Did you ever finish it?
I didn't.
Did you ever finish it?
No.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of a clue as to what it was. At one point in time, I'm not going to ruin the story. At one point in time, they're sitting in the studio, and John Lennon comes in, and he's like, "Hey, I just had this great conversation with this guy by the name of Alan Klein. He manages the Rolling Stones. I mean, I think he'd be a great manager for us. We and they're like, okay, well, why don't we meet him or whatever else? And you see that starting to happen. John's super excited about it. Well, John got George and Ringo on board with him. McCartney never did. McCartney wanted Linda Eastman's father or uncle to be the manager, one of the Eastmans. And it caused a big disagreement. And the 3 of them thought that Paul was trying to take control of the band by bringing it to somebody in his family that was going to be in charge of it and manage them. And so that created some of the issues. As it turns out, he was right. Alan Klein was a crook. And they all ended up suing Alan Klein 2 or 3 years later and completely disavowed anything that he had done. But it was business stuff. They had started this company together of Apple Records. They were struggling to figure out how to run a business together. So there's a lot that took place. It wasn't just musically.
And it wasn't just personally, like a lot of people can chalk it up to either. But
and George said to I think the day he died almost, he said, Paul and he were okay. They got along. They were friends. They would get together. They'd have dinner and they'd chat. But he said he didn't think he could ever be in a band with him. He just said that musically, Paul was too controlling, and he said he didn't think that he could be in a band with Paul McCartney again. He said he could probably have been in a band with John Lennon, but not Paul McCartney. So there was still, because musically we're just too different, and we're just, so it's interesting. I think you can see it when you watch the video of the anthology. I think you can still see George's in his face. I think you can still see his resentment towards Paul, and even clips that made it into the anthology documentary.
Yeah. You mean when they're doing the modern day interviews with the 3 of them?
Or they're sitting around.
He has the long hair.
Yeah. That, or they're sitting around and they're playing.
Yeah.
And Paul's like, well, we should do this. And George just kind of, it's kind of
body language.
For those of you listening, not talking, I just rolled my eyes and kind of leaned to the side and looked at Jason like he's crazy.
Well, so you're not wrong.
But yeah, so there was that. But these guys' personalities came through so strongly on these records. We all feel as though when we listen to the records that we know these guys. I doubt any of us truly do. Recently, I read something about Paul McCartney has a shield around him, and nobody is allowed inside of it, except for George and John and Ringo. All had the same shield, and they were all inside that same bubble. But we feel when we listen to this music that we know these guys. It comes through. I don't feel that way with other bands. I'm a big fan. I'm a huge fan of Guns N' Roses.
Yeah.
But I don't feel as when I listen to their music or I watch stuff, even if I watch stuff about them, if I watch their videos, I don't feel like I know anything about those guys truly. You hear rumors about Axl Rose and how he was hard to work with, but I don't feel like I know any of those guys at any level. I feel like I know these 4 guys.
Right.
And it's mostly through their music.
Yeah.
And if there is an example of the Beatles from the late 80s in the hair metal era, they would be a pretty strong contender because
their music seems to be holding on to new generations and stuff. A lot of, especially some of the stuff off of Appetite.
Right.
Really holds on for new generations are picking up. There's a few bands out there that have had it. and it's mainly, to me, it seems to be the heavy rock ones that go along with sports and that kind of atmosphere.
Yeah.
That a lot of that really holds on with, because it continues to get used
Right.
in a public way all the time.
Yeah, we had talked about Guns N' Roses, Ozzy Osbourne,
AC/DC.
AC/DC. I mean,
Yeah.
the sport. It doesn't matter what the sport
Right.
or American sports. They're
Yeah.
the ones up there. So sorry, we kind of got sidetracked.
We got sidetracked there a little bit from it, but yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is the importance of the album is really what to me, as much as the individual music is a big part of it. We were talking about the concept, so they went from Sgt. Pepper's to the White Album, to Magic Mystery Tour. The White Album really wasn't a concept album, other than the idea that, hey, let's put two discs, two LPs together. It's a double album, and
double album, really.
Right. And I don't know how much the idea of a double album before that was popular. I don't know if that was something that they kind of pushed people into thinking about it as a double album or not.
I can't think of a lot before then.
So that may have been
especially not
part of the
before '68.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that may have been part of the push for it. But then you also have, honestly, Let It Be is a concept album. A lot of people don't think of it that way, but Let It Be was as much of a concept album as any album that they did. Let's sit and write an entire album's worth of songs and perform it live on TV. And that's how we're going to record the album.
Yeah.
It faltered and failed and didn't quite get there, but a lot of what you hear on Let It Be is, the famous album cover, a nice square
hype sticker.
type sticker on it.
Yes.
A lot of the songs that you hear on the record were recorded. The primary recording and the bass track is either a live version in the studio or from the rooftop concert.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Phil Spector came in and did a whole bunch of stuff on top of a lot of it, but that's why
orchestration, and
that's why Paul McCartney eventually went back and stripped all the stuff that Phil Spector did out of it and released it with the way that they had recorded it in the studio and on the rooftop. But a lot of the
was that
performances.
Let It Be Naked?
Yeah,
So that was driven by Paul?
that was driven by Paul.
I did not know that. I thought
Yeah.
that was a record company thing.
No, I was driven by Paul. The one song I think that, from my understanding,
and
Long and Winding Road was the one that he was really upset that Phil Spector messed with, because he put so much orchestration and everything underneath it when he thought it was really much more of a quieter song.
And that's the one, when I listened to Let It Be Naked, it was a revelation. Yeah. It's like, oh my God.
But, One After 909 wasn't written for the Let It Be session, but it was recorded live on the rooftop. One After 909 was actually written in 1962 or something like that.
It was an early one.
Before they even became big. And on the anthology album, they actually included one of their original attempts to record the song back in 1963.
Huh.
I'm pretty sure it's on on the first anthology album.
Well, I just so happen to have this unbelievable version of Anthology 1 that was gifted to me by one Keith Toombs. And let's look.
I'm almost positive that it was on here. I don't see it listed on the... Yep, nope, right there. One After 909, there's a whole sequence they put on here, and then they put a complete version of it. And it looks like it probably was recorded around the time of Please Please Me.
Huh.
Shortly after that. It may have been actually one of the first songs they tried to record for the first session following Please Please Me. Because, they recorded Please Please Me in a single day. One 12-hour session. They recorded the entire album. And so...
Which is hard to believe.
Yeah. It's just incredible that they could crank out that kind of quality in that kind of time. But, that wasn't uncommon for the day. Elvis Presley cranked out song after song in single sessions and things.
But Elvis used a lot of studio musicians. Elvis had a bass band, but used a lot of studio musicians.
The thing that's crazy about the Elvis stuff, though, is that it's even less than what the Beatles had after the Please Please Me and stuff, and that it was what you played is what was there.
Yeah.
There was no overdubbing. There was no
overdubbing.
It was, you play the song, you do 7 takes, and you finally get it right, and you go, okay, that's the one, and that's the one that went into print.
I just am thinking back, and it's almost been 30 years since these anthologies came out, right? 94.
Yeah, it was mid-90s. So
94.
Yeah.
So it's been 28 years. I remember when all of this stuff came out and there was the companion video stuff that, the finishing the 2 incomplete songs with the surviving members and using John's recorded vocals and stuff. And I'm sure they used other stuff that he did.
I have someplace the VHS tapes of that anthology series.
Oh, yeah,
the video.
Yeah.
I do. I will say quickly though, on a side note about those 2 songs, is I thought "Free as a Bird" was great. It was an original song nobody ever heard before. The Real Love had actually been released.
Had it
on the Imagine soundtrack for the documentary. Imagine.
Oh, okay.
The demo version that he had done had been released, so it wasn't brand new to me when I heard it, which I was disappointed with.
Which is a great movie and a great soundtrack.
The soundtrack, that soundtrack got me through. I listened to that a ton when I was in college. I love that soundtrack because for me, again, this is a collection of songs, but it was crafted in a way that really takes you through John Lennon's life.
Yeah, it kind of had a narrative.
Yeah, and from the time of the Beatles' early hits to then through the Beatles stuff to the Beatles breaking up, and with the inclusion of the song "How" and the song "God" on it, and "Mother," you see the anguish and the things that he was dealing with and the fighting, and then you get into the stuff that started to appear on Double Fantasy, and the uplifting and the where he was in life, and you really get a sense for that. And then if you know the story, there's a very tragic ending to it.
Yeah.
Which I think most people know the story.
Yeah.
But so you go from you see this guy that came up, was happy, and you see it transform into this guy that was searching for something, and it finally seemed like he found himself. And then, the next part of the story is that he was cut short from ever going forward with that that part of his life.
And I will never forget the way that documentary ends with that, with the glasses falling and then that opening or the ending chord from A Day in the Life. I mean, it made a huge impact, obviously. But
again, I think collection-wise, as a collection, it's interesting because it really does tell a story within itself.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very interesting in that sense.
And that's one that I don't have on vinyl that I really should.
Yeah.
Imagine. Yeah.
But so let's talk. Let's go and change back into subject. So they released all these things through the 60s. Then you get into the 70s, and they released they started the idea of, okay, we have all these songs. Let's start putting the things together and selling more records. So you have the red and the blue that came out.
Yep.
They came out in the early 70s. I think it was 73 maybe when they came out. It's just a way of reintroducing some of the music. Then they covered the whole genre and the nice thing about it was in 4 LPs, they had they covered the entire time frame of the Beatles,
the history
recording.
Yeah.
And the cool thing with the cover, the front cover has the young Beatles, and the back cover, the older Beatles.
It's the same photo taken 7 or 8 years apart or whatever. So if you look at this photo here, that's the older one that was taken obviously at some point in time, 69 probably, before they broke up, which I don't know what the photo was taken for, because they didn't use it for anything until 1973.
Right.
They obviously didn't take this picture in 1973.
Well, maybe they thought it would just be cool to take the picture in the same place that they did for Please Please Me, right?
It also goes to, I think so, but it also goes to something that they deny it. You don't hear a whole lot of talk about it, or they tend to deny that this was ever a thought. I really think that they knew, in almost every level, they really knew that Abbey Road was probably the final thing that they were going to do.
Yeah.
They were very retrospective. The fact that they went back and took a picture that matched the first album cover.
Yeah.
Why do you do that unless you really are thinking about the fact that we're going to kind of bookend this whole thing.
Yeah.
And like I said, you watch Get Back, they talk very clearly about the Beatles as an entity separate from themselves.
Yeah.
Because they even talk about what's expected of them as the Beatles, and what they want to do as individuals, and what they want to do as people. And so there was some thought, there had to be, and the structure of Abbey Road, the fact that you have a medley of songs that are just pieces of things that have just all been thrown together to finish off an album. Why would you throw together a bunch of pieces unless you thought there was not going to be a need for any of those pieces going forward? The fact that they recorded the song "The End" at the end of the thing, and you just simply look at the lines. The love you take is equal to the love you make. The fact that it's the first and only time that there's a drum solo in the Beatles recorded music.
Yeah.
The fact that all three of the guitarists in the band played solos in the song. It's just there's too much going on there that points to the idea that they were done than it just to be pure coincidence.
Yeah.
And the other thing to think about when you look at it from today's perspective, there's a huge difference in the way that bands approach members leaving or stopping. No band is ever over with. Every band is doing a farewell tour. That farewell tour has no limit to how long it is. This was at a time where if a band said they were done, most of the time they were.
I'm actually kind of glad that the Beatles never did get back together.
Yeah.
I'm not happy about the fact that after 1980 they didn't have the opportunity to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
As a group and tour, but I'm almost kind of glad they didn't get together because it wouldn't have been them necessarily in the same way. It would be cool to have seen the four of them play together.
Yeah.
But they all did so much on their own too. That's the thing.
Yeah.
They all had such good solo careers. You didn't, they didn't just disappear.
The great thing about them is that they did make the conscious decision to stop, and it stayed that way, except for Paul and John possibly wanting to go perform on Saturday Night Live for $300, which never happened. But that whole movie and idea behind that was really great too. But they are a success story in that even though they were part of this huge thing, this entity that was not them, they each transcended that, for at least 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
And then, and then others longer. That's a success story within a success story, I think.
Yeah.
And you saw shades of that with the different songs being like Taxman opening up Revolver, and that's what I think is great. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's it lasted the length of time it did, and it was over.
Yeah, and then so we hit these in the 70s. So we're in the early 70s now. We've gotten past the band breaking up. They released these two. Capitol released the Red and the Blue, and kind of sparked interest in things. You move past that, there's not a whole lot of activity. There really wasn't much activity in anything until the mid-'80s, partially because they got into battles over rights for the music. Like we talked about a little bit earlier, is that they got into battles over rights for things. They weren't things that were being done cohesively as a band, as individuals. And that's what I have the list here of individual album sales. So we'll go into this, and this will lead me to the next thing. Sgt. Pepper's got 32 million albums sold.
That's a couple.
The one that surprises me still to this day is, as we're moving forward in time, once they got past the anthologies, they still wanted to be putting new collections together. They released the singles, or the one album, which was all the number one hits.
Yeah.
It has sold almost equal of number of albums as Sgt. Pepper. It is their second. It is either their first or second. 2004. 2000.
Oh, 2000.
And it has sold 32 million records as well.
So
it's matched Sgt. Pepper, and it's and I think about the fact that 32 million for Sgt. Pepper includes the re-release that was done a couple of years ago.
Well, I mean, what it has going for it is the 7 years before the iPhone.
Yes. And that's a big thing. But you go down through the list. The Abbey Road's next with 19 million. The Blue Beatles record actually sold 14 million copies. The White Album has sold 13 million. The Red sold 13 million. Rubber Soul is the next one on the list, and it was at 8.5 million. So there's a big drop off at that point. But then you get down into these later ones. You got another collection that came much later, the Cirque du Soleil show. Love soundtrack. This has sold 8 million albums, 8 million copies.
And I love this. This is the most cohesive compilation I think that they've put together.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's written for a live performance of a Cirque du Soleil show to be over the top of it. But I'm trying to get, so you don't have anything in here from the 70s really of stuff that was released as new albums.
Except for not Yesterday and Today, but Hey Jude.
Hey Jude was...
Right?
And it was actually late 60s when it was released, I think.
Was it?
Yeah, because it came out before Let It Be.
Oh, okay.
And what's interesting is you have to come way down the list. So they put out rock and roll music in 1980, which sold some things. There was a rock and roll music and another rock and roll music that came out in 76. And these are all just old stuff that they had from back even before they were recording for EMI, I think. But so you don't really get to these albums that were new albums being put out. But what changed it all was 1987 with the CD release. That CD release...
And he's got a shoebox full of them.
Started in 1987. Well, technically, the first Beatles album released on CD was Abbey Road in 1983.
Really?
It was a Japanese release of Abbey Road in 1983.
1983.
Which the first commercial CDs weren't available to buy until 1982. And actually, the first album I believe that was sold commercially was Billy Joel's 52nd Street.
52nd Street.
I think was the first album sold on CD officially.
Wow.
Commercially. And so they did a Japanese version of Abbey Road in 1983. But then they started releasing the CDs, which Capitol, they're all released under the Capitol name, I believe, on the CDs. Well, EMI. No, they're still all EMI.
Are they EMI Parlophone? Yeah, this is Parlophone.
Yeah. And so they released all the CDs, and that sold a whole bunch of albums.
Yeah.
So over the next couple of years, they ended up releasing all of them. And then in 88, you hadn't been able to buy them for a long time. And like we talked about, even through the end of their career, they never put singles on the albums, or they didn't put a lot of the singles on albums. They were unavailable. So they came out with the Pastmasters.
Yes.
These first appeared on CD. This was the Pastmasters albums were a CD from 1988, and it was the way of getting the singles out for people to buy them. Since nobody was buying
singles anymore.
LP singles, and the CD singles weren't really that big of a thing. The CDs came out in 1988, and that gave you the entire officially released Beatles collection on CD that hadn't been available on anything other than the original vinyl. I don't know. Did they release them on cassette tape?
The
Beatles albums, did they release any of them on cassette, or they were all still caught up in the?
I think they still released them on cassette too.
Did they?
Yeah.
But so, it kind of created an album of its own, which is an interesting listen to me. I think it's very interesting if you listen to their singles compared to the albums.
Yeah.
They were much more rock driven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The especially early on, the first half of the singles, they were very rock driven songs. That's what they released as singles.
Well, run down a list of some of the songs that are on that.
Well, you start with "Love Me Do," and which was their original single. With the B-side was "From Me to You." You have "Thank You Girl," "She Loves You," "I'll Get You," "I Want to Hold Your Hand," "This Boy." Then you have the two German recordings of "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "She Loves You,"
which he knows all the words to.
And then Long Tall Sally, I Call Your Name, Slow Down, Matchbox. These are the ones where I really feel like they were still recording rock songs as singles and not putting them on the album. That's where you get the Slow Down, Matchbox, I Feel Fine, She's a Woman, Bad Boy, Yes It Is, I'm Down. That was all the Rubber Soul, Revolver era singles.
Yeah.
And they were all still pretty rock driven. Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out, Paperback Writer, Rain. Rain has been given a lot of credence by people as to being pretty innovative. It's Ringo's favorite song of his drumming that they did. Because Rain also included some backwards looping sounds and things.
Yep.
It was during that experimental period. So those, like I said, that middle section especially was very rock driven compared to the songs you were getting on the albums at the time. But
And then notice the last song on the last side of this is You Know My Name, Look Up the Number.
yeah. I don't know why that was included other than they just needed a filler for the backside of
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let It Be. Now, I am not intimately familiar with the singles themselves as to how they were released and exactly when, but
Right.
but it's a certainly was an interesting way to get those singles out there.
Yeah, that's kind
A
of cool.
collection of singles.
Yeah.
And you've seen it in a lot of other ways now that you have other collections of singles from groups that have been released, and they've done some other things. But so you've got all these collections throughout the years. You know, they've done things. They've gone back and they've released the Decca recording tapes that they did, the demo versions they did for Decca, which is interesting because you get a different version of Money that they recorded, Till There Was You, songs that they recorded, but then you have other songs that you never heard them. You know, these are actually the Decca tapes here. My Bonnie, Love Me Do. So you get to hear another version of Love Me Do.
The Love Me Do controversy.
Yeah, so there's just a lot of different stuff that they've released throughout the years in these types of albums. I have a few down here that are just weird things. That this one is The World's Greatest. I don't know what it is other than a collection of Beatles songs. It's got Get Back, Can He Walk, Let It Be, Teddy Don't Worry, On Your Way Home. It just, and I got this
strange
record
collection.
Yeah, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling. It's basically I don't know. I really don't know what it is, but it's got music on it, and I listen to it. I've got a issue of the last live show that they did,
Which was
1966, August of 1966 at Candlestick Park.
Oh, the Candlestick.
No kidding.
But
wow.
A lot of information on the sleeve.
Yeah.
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 I'm sure there's a lot of crowd noise.
It's got a round hype sticker that I think is original.
Which is absolute. I don't care what decade it is. It's absolute bullshit.
Maybe it's not an original
Trademarked by quality.
sticker. I got the complete Beatles Christmas collection. So all of the little Christmas records that they did. Again, it's got the round hype sticker.
Yeah, I
that
know.
I don't even know what that means. Trademark of quality with a hog on it.
I just turned this sumbitch around to look at the track listing, and it's
not there.
There's nothing.
This one's actually got a little bit of information on it. The case is in pretty bad shape, but it's the American Tour with Ed Rudy. It's a news documentary.
So it's probably intermixed like news stories with interviews.
I'll be quite honest with you. My plan was to sit and to listen to all of these odd ones before I came in.
And you didn't.
And I've been so busy, I did not have the time to sit down and do that recently.
I
I
think you've done some work here.
Yes.
So there's all these kinds of crazy things that are out there. The one thing that we talked early on about the development of the album, the only way that I have found that you can buy, either finding them in used record stores or online, the only other way that you can buy the original American album released versions is that Capitol put out a CD set.
A box set
That has all of the albums. They're not in order.
Go ahead and talk into the mic.
That have the original Mike or the original. I said mic because you talked about the mic. They have the original track listings of the American versions. They are replicas of the album covers, and the track listings are identical to what the original records were. It does not have that original VJ introducing the Beatles record as part of it.
Yeah, because
it wasn't Capitol.
Huh.
So these are all the Capitol records.
This came out at a time when I literally had like maybe a nickel to rub together with a penny, and I never got it.
So it starts with the Beatles' second album.
Well, no, those aren't in order.
They're not in order.
Because the second album is actually their third album. Because you had Introducing the Beatles that came out before Meet the Beatles, and then the second album. And then you had 65 released in 64. And this also does not include, though, that does not have the Hey Jude album as part of the collection of it. But so it's just an interesting way. If you're going to collect them, that's the only way I found that you can find those records produced that way. Maybe there's some other out there.
It's interesting to me that they haven't done that as well. Wait a minute, you brought your CD box set that came out in 2009 with you. Yeah. Which is a big deal. I got this too. This came out, this is the stereo version. It also came out in mono. Mm-hmm. This was kind of like the contemporary reintroduction. Mm-hmm. After Anthology, this was put together, and man, was I excited when they did this.
And I don't think I have ever listened. These are the same ways as the others are. It's got I've never opened them and I've never listened to them.
Oh my God, I've opened all of mine.
And so you've got all the original albums on CD with original artwork. Now these have all been made into gatefolds.
Yeah. Which is,
and they all have little booklets and stuff in them as well. But yeah, I've not opened any of these CDs and actually listened to this set. I had the music in so many other versions. I don't really need to.
Right.
And again, the CDs really aren't any different other than they're a stereo mix, even of the early albums, which my other CDs are mono mixes. And this is what's interesting to me is this is the American version of Magical Mystery Tour. Mm-hmm. Even though it's part of the American version, I think the CD version of Magical Mystery Tour that originally came out in 1987, it's a full album, but the second half of the album is the instrumental score from the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas this, for whatever reason, they put the American version in this box because it's got the songs.
It's more like Help.
It's got the songs that were released on the American version of the album.
Yeah.
These aren't all American versions. These are primarily British versions.
And it's interesting that's a.
But yeah, I haven't actually opened them and listened to them. It's just for me, it's a collector set that I have that it's going to be worth something to me someday that nobody else will care about. My kids will get and they'll throw it away.
No, they won't. They'll probably throw your records away, but not the CDs.
No, I've got my youngest one hopefully hooked on it. He, he's got his first record that he goes up and does the same thing I do, which is put it on the record player and lay flat on my back and stare at the ceiling.
There's nothing wrong with listening that way.
A deep listen.
Maybe put some headphones on.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting you say that. That's one of the reasons why with the Revolver stuff they wanted to go back and redo it because it was so heavily stereo. Apparently there are people that have complained about trying to listen to Revolver and Rubber Soul in earbuds can have an effect of making people sick because of the sounds being so often in different ways. It's very discomforting for people.
That's
and so that's one of the reasons why they want to remix them as well. So they want to remix them so that they can be done for people to listen. And that's something that a lot of people don't realize, that you have all these different re-releases of things. You kind of have to mix the sound differently depending on where your target audience is going to be playing. The mix that you're going to have on an LP that I'm going to be listening to through my turntable and my speakers that I've got hooked up to my turntable is going to have a different quality to it than what I'm listening to a CD that's playing through my computer speakers.
Right.
Or that I'm streaming that's playing through my computer speakers. Or nice headphones that are expensive, really ones that have good, rich sound. Or the cheap little earbuds that I buy because I lose earbuds like crazy. So I buy the $10, $15 versions, and that's how I listen to stuff when I'm cutting grass or if I'm traveling or something. And I just need something small to pack and stick in my pocket. You kind of have to mix it for different scenarios.
The whole world is like opened up now with the revelations from Peter Jackson's documentary series. And is there any idea of what they're going to do next? Are they going to go chronologically?
I don't know. I just read the quote from Giles Martin that said that he, this kind of opens up these early albums for that same kind of treatment.
That's great that possibility exists.
One of the things I have not gotten my hands on the set for Revolver yet. I'd like to listen to, but I have heard a clip out of one of them that I didn't realize. Everybody always kind of equates Paul McCartney having written Yellow Submarine. It's definitely got his sound to it. Obviously it's Ringo singing it, but it's got his sound to it. But there's a clip of John Lennon that came out with his Revolver set playing the first line of the song in a much weirder, slower version, almost sad, melancholy, in the town where I was born.
Yeah.
Instead of it being an upbeat celebration of this guy that had a submarine, it was, this kind of melancholy in the town where I was born. What is the next line he uses? It's in the town where I was born. Nothing's changed.
Yeah.
Something like that, But it's again, there's just so much. There's so much stuff you could dive into with this stuff. The album aspect is something I think is very interesting.
It's been awesome to like dig into it and look at it that way, because I think it's a perspective that not a lot of people think about anymore. And it's funny to me. I wanted to make this point earlier, is that the music industry started with singles, right? Mm-hmm. And now we're back to that. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, digital versus analog.
Right.
I mean, the only person I ever hear about you selling albums anymore is Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
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 And it's all digital album.
But
nobody listens. Nobody listens to the songs the way that they're presented to them. They listen to them however they want to.
Well, she has put that Midnight's album out in 5 different configurations.
It is nice to see the resurgence in the last 5-10 years of the vinyl. I still think it's a little expensive.
Oh, it's a lot expensive
for a lot of people to get into. It's expensive for me to get into in a big way. That's why I don't have all the stuff of the Beatles. It's just I have 2 kids and a mortgage and a car payment, and I've got other things that I got to spend money on. I don't have time to listen to it all anyway.
Yeah,
the way I really want to right now. So but it's just too expensive to buy it anyway.
Well, one other thing. Did you have any other records you wanted to mention?
I had 2 other records I brought with me, because they're actually, honestly, the only 2 other actual vinyl records I have of Beatles stuff. That is, I've got the Imagine album, which again, as an album, is I think Lennon's best of his early stuff. I'm particular to his Walls and Bridges album. It's probably my favorite of his solo stuff. But these guys are still putting out music. How many years later?
Yeah.
This came out in 2020.
Yeah. And they've actually done a new version of that called McCartney 3 Imagined, where different artists record these songs in their own way. And there were multiple versions of this when it first came out.
This is a
you
colored,
got me the orange one.
Yeah, and this one is the orange one as well. So they released these in all different colors. And what they've started doing with so many of them, I'm sure you guys know this a lot more than I do and talked about, is it's interesting because Target will have the green one. Mm-hmm. Walmart will have the red one, which doesn't make sense with Target's colors.
Right.
But, this is the orange one. And the orange one was just a special one that our company that we own together's color is orange. And so it's one that I bought for him when it came out. But it's interesting that how he sold more albums by getting people to buy multiple versions of it, just because the color of the disc is different. Yeah. Or the color of the
it's part of the
vinyl is different.
That goes into the vinyl.
The one thing that I wanted to touch on before we close up is, why do you think that a bunch of middle-aged dudes are sitting around still talking about this music the way we still are? Because obviously we have the Beatles to blame for the sickness and the amount of money that we spend on all these records, since basically they kind of pushed that idea and really brought it to the masses. But why are we still talking about the Beatles?
I think that music, in a lot of ways, has a very natural rhythm in us. There's things that we could do. I mean, you find therapists and things that use certain types of sounds to try to put people in certain moods and things. And I think it does that. And I think whatever it was about the music that these four guys made, and mainly that the three guys wrote, that just they had a talent that's unparalleled as four people working together. And it wasn't, like we said to begin with, it wasn't just the four of them. George Martin has very, very big role.
Brian Epstein
in the music, and Brian Epstein in the marketing and the promotion, and that side of it certainly had a lot of effect as to why they got in front of us, which is part of it. Some of the best musicians that have been out there, you and I've never heard of.
Right.
They played local bars, and they maybe made the rounds, and maybe made it to the point where they'd sell 200 tickets a night. But they just never had the right marketing around them. They never had the right people behind them pushing them to get their stuff out there. The Beatles got lucky. Brian Epstein found them.
Well, the only reason I mentioned Epstein is because he didn't have that influence from the musical direction, but all of his steering them in the ways that he did gave them the platform, gave them the opportunity to do anything they wanted.
The Beatles were big in Liverpool before Brian Epstein found them. I don't know if they ever would have gone anything beyond that if it hadn't been for Brian Epstein.
Yeah.
He's the one that showed up and said, I want to manage you. He's the one that got them in front of George Martin at EMI. You know, he's the one that made those things happen. That's why I say the talent was there. And it would have been a real shame if the world had lost the talent of these guys to be there. But Brian Epstein was the one that found them and got them to the places to get them the exposure. It's true of all kinds of art. There's talented artists, there's talented musicians, there's talented actors, there's talented painters. You know, all kinds of performers, all kinds of things. That the work just it's a marketing thing. It's a
distribution.
It's a business thing at that point. Distribution, yeah. It's gotten easier, I think, for some distribution because you can create it on your own and you can put it out there on your own. But you still got to have somebody that knows how to go out and the right people to push it to get to that next level. And they did. And thankfully, Brian Epstein saw that in them and saw what could be there and pushed for them and really went and pushed hard. I mean, they went a lot of places before they finally got picked up by EMI. You know, the story goes that EMI was the last record label in England that they could have possibly gone to. They'd been to every other one. Decca said that guitar music was dead. You know,
in the early 60s.
Yeah, and so, you know, there's all kinds of stories about how hard Epstein worked to get them to where they needed to be, and so that's part of it. But like I said, I really think I know he gets a lot of credit, but George Martin not only produced it, but he influenced them. He was just as innovative in the recording technique and pushing them in directions, bringing the orchestral scores into things, you know, little things like helping them to experiment with tape looping and doing other things. He was a huge part of that development of the band as well, but they just hit something. They had something that hits people at a level that they're not aware of. It's not that I think everybody likes it. There are songs that I don't necessarily particularly seek out, but when I hear them, they put me in a certain mood. They make me feel a certain way. And these guys had it. They hit something. Whatever it was, they had magic for a lot of years. But they really captured magic in a bottle for about 10 years there collectively. The 6 or 7 where they were really in the prime of their Beatles stuff, and then the few years after that, they all were still capturing that magic and putting it away.
It's an amazing story. The other George Martin thing, didn't you tell me that he play the it sounds like a harpsichord solo on In My Life?
Yes.
But he couldn't play it that fast, so he recorded it slower
and then sped the tape up.
And that's why
it's played on a piano. but it has that sound of a harpsichord because he played it slower so he could play it. And that's the thing too. They were experimenting with speeding things up and slowing them down so that it would give it a different sound.
Yeah.
But that's what so it's actually George Martin playing a piano on the solo for In My Life.
Which,
not a harpsichord.
He's all over all of their stuff, but with little details like that. And I'm sure there are hundreds and hundreds more.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's fantastic that at least the baton has been passed to his son to kind of be one of the curators of this too. It's a little weird, but I think that they connect with us on a cosmic level, that almost everybody is born with that DNA that just appreciates the Beatles music. And, they may have been saying that about Mozart 200 years ago or whatever, but like you said.
But we still listen to Mozart.
Right. And like you said at the beginning of the show, I don't think there's any span of time that's going to happen where people aren't still talking about and appreciating this music.
Oh, yeah.
And the good thing for us is that we, unlike Mozart and unlike Beethoven, we do get to hear it in the way that they intended us to at the time.
Yep.
Now, there's multiple iterations. I don't necessarily always agree with remixing songs just to remix them, because part of it, the art was at the time. That's what you had available to you to do, and you did what you did with it. And at the time, you said, this is what we wanted people to hear, and you put it out there.
Yeah.
So going back and revisiting it over and over is not always my favorite thing.
Right.
I like it when the new stuff comes out, the little tidbits of things that weren't out before that come out, that behind the scenes stuff. But no, we're lucky that our musicians now, we have their take on it out there.
Yep.
And that's why, Paul McCartney went back and redid Let It Be, because they lost control of that record. He didn't feel as though Let It Be was the record they wanted it to be. So he went out and he finally stripped out all the stuff that Phil Spector did and put out the album that he thought Let It Be should have been. Which,
to my knowledge, Let It Be Naked still hasn't been released on vinyl. Maybe it has. I'm sure that there's bootleg copies of it, but that's definitely one that I want. I mean, it's fantastic. And I think that was 03 or 04, so it's almost been 20 years since that came out. Man, we can't thank you enough for taking all the time to do all the research, to put all this stuff together. This is one of what I'm sure will be many Beatles-themed shows. I mean, it's a year in the making. We've been waiting a year to sit down and talk for a couple of hours about the Beatles, but we just can't thank you enough for it. It's just been a blast, and you sharing all of that. You may not think so, but your love of this band and your reverence for it is super impressive and important, and being able to share it with other people is a special thing, and the fact that you agreed to share it with us and our audience, really, it means a lot to us. So.
Well, I appreciate you having me here, despite my lack of not liking to be in front of people.
Well,
no.
So
we're not worthy. We're not worthy.
But we also appreciate everything else that you've done for the show, because you've been one of the biggest people that has helped us get it out in the way you and Jacob Hansen. But we also want to thank everybody out there that's keeping this sickness alive. The holidays are coming up. It's a prime time for records right now. So, hopefully we've put the bug in everybody's ear out there with Beatles stuff, and I'm sure that there will be, as there always is, an uptick in their sales around the holidays, because that seems to be kind of a theme that I've noticed. There will be another iteration. There will be other themes and ways to talk about this, and anytime we do a Beatles show, you're going to be right there in that chair.
Well, now
maybe a different one.
Now we got 4 different shows we can do on solo albums.
That's true.
Yeah.
So just right there, you got a whole other layer of things.
Very true.
Well, show ideas, share them with us, send them to us. If you want to hear more stuff about Beatles, let us know. We just want to thank Keith and Jacob and everybody out there that's still downloading this show. I mean, the shows have just kept going on and on and on, and the downloads have gone up and up and up. And anyway, for Keith, for Wheels, I'm Jay, and we'll see you all the next time around.
It's a final adventure.